Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com. I'm here today with a project update video for this 1/6 scale M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman tank. Since the last video update, the very last of the underhull details have been completed and added to this model. This is including, but is not limited to, the drive sprockets and the deflector grille. In this video, we're going to be going over all this info, so just sit back, relax, and enjoy. Starting this video out strong takes us to a bunch of new detail components that are going to be added to this model in order to flesh it out past the point that we have here. All these detail components have been added to the EastCoastArmory.com Sherman catalog page, as well as the subsequent pages that are, well, Sherman related, like the M3 Lee, the M7 Priest, so on and so forth. Some of the items I'm going to show are brand new, like the ones that we have here on the table I'll get to in a moment, and others are replacing old legacy catalog items that were definitely long in the tooth and have been since put out to pasture. But let's go ahead and dig right in to the set that we have right here in front of us. And obviously, if you have a brainstem, you'll recognize what this is. This here is the new ECA 1/6 scale VVSS Sherman Sprocket set. The sprockets were something that have been eluding me for quite some time. I never really made them in the past specifically for the Sherman because on previous builds I would just frankly use the cast rest ones from Panzerwerk, as his were flawless. They were beautiful castings, awesome sprockets. You can see them on some of the older builds that are found on the ECA channel, like the M10s for instance. Those sprockets were wonderful, however, regrettably and unfortunately, Panzerwerk is no longer in existence, so once that happened, those old excellent items went belly up. Well, fast forward now to about 10 years, maybe more later, it's now my turn to go ahead and step up to the plate and offer a good set of replacement sprockets for the Sherman. The sprockets that we have here are actually in timing with the Dragon 1/6 scale Sherman kit. The reason why I went with Sherman, or I should say Dragon pattern of Sherman tracks, is because on this build here I have a set of Dragon 1/6 scale Sherman tracks left over from another build I did a number of years ago, and those are going to be simply used on the Sherman here. So these sprockets here are timed for that model. The other sprockets that I do have on the website aren't really full sprockets, but they are just sprocket rings. Those are in spec with the Panzerwerk pattern of track, and the two are not compatible. However, in the world that we're living in right now, the Dragon 1/6 scale Sherman track seems to be the de facto standard for Sherman tank tracks, so I went ahead and just rendered it in that format. What we have here is, again, a set, and it's basically an accompanying set to another detail set that I released a little while ago, which were the final drives. This one here basically is the matching set to work with the ECA final drives. We'll see what they look like in a moment when they get installed in place, but rest assured, when I was designing these components here, they were meant to work with one another. And you can see that with the way the design is. These sprockets here are as realistic as I can possibly make, where I luckily had lots of really excellent examples of photographs of Sherman VVS sprockets from all of the Shermans that I personally visited. So you're going to get some really good detailing on these sets here, and there's going to be some really cool features. The sprockets are also sold in a couple options, where we have two patterns of drums, which you'll see in a moment, and one set, or I should say one option, is to use one pattern of drum, the second is to use the other pattern of drum, and the third option is to have one of each. And there's a reason for that, and I'll go over that in a moment. The other thing I want to mention is that the sprocket tooth ring here is representing the late pattern of Sherman sprocket, and if anyone is interested for me to design some of the other patterns, like the earliest open spoke or even the dimpled spoke one, I could definitely do that, but I would need to be, someone could reach out to me, and that'll give me a little bit of motivation to go ahead and shift a little bit of time to finish off those sets. But anyway, if anyone is interested in that, you could be reached, or I should say I could be reached via the email address listed below, info@EastCoastArmory.com. All right. Enough of that, let's actually dig into the set that we have here. First thing I want to mention is that all of the components that you see here on the table are 3D print. The only components that are not 3D print are some bits of hardware, like some fasteners over here, as well as some steel shafts, and we'll see why in a moment. Starting with the sprocket tooth ring, you can see the unit in closer depth. First thing I also want to mention is that the material that these things are printed in is the same material that I've been using on several other of my 3D prints as of late. The material bridges surface fidelity and strength very well, and the units look as if they were made out of injection molded polystyrene. On that note, because I know someone's going to ask me, can these be used for radio controlled? I personally do not recommend that. These things are plastic after all, and just for a sprocket tooth ring for a radio control tank of 1/6 scale, I would prefer if the pieces were made out of metal. Having said that, however, if anyone is interested to have rings like this made out of metal, that's something that is an option, but again, that's something that I can look into if someone reaches out to me via the email address, again, that I mentioned before. So here you can see the sprocket tooth ring itself. Like I mentioned before, these are to Dragon spec. You can see it has the appropriate shape here of the late pattern sprocket ring with the fastener location holes integrally built in. And on the reverse side over here, you get to see the inner recess right here. The recess is found on the real unit, and it's also done in a way to help lock it onto the center spindle here, which again is true to form to the real unit. The next thing I want to mention are the spindles themselves. So here you get to see the main drums, and like I stated before, there are going to be several options of these things offered. And if you are observant, you'll notice that one drum here has little support ribs, and the other one does not. This is, again, true to form. And if you're also wondering, well, why do I have one of each? Well, several of the real Shermans that I've went ahead and actually visited and did photographic references on actually have literally one of each of these sprockets, so it's kind of funny how that works out. It's just not unexpected, like we see that with the row wheels. A lot of times you have mix and match on these things, but either way the point still stands. You do have an option to have either both the same or one of each. Again, just depends on your taste and what you're looking for out of your build. The units are extremely realistic with their design. This is basically what it looks like on the real unit. We have a nice little hollow drum over here. We have the face section, and we have two flange areas for fasteners to be bolted in place. The larger holes here are to secure this to the spindle, and this is something that is going to be attached to the final drive, but again, I'll show that momentarily. On the spindles themselves, this is actually the portion that we see when we look at a Sherman tank. So if we look at the center portion of the hub, you will actually see this disc over here with this divot in the center. And that's not part of the sprocket, that's part of the final drive. On the real unit, this section here has several large fasteners that emerge, or I should say threaded rods that emerge from this unit over here, and the piece just bolts onto it, much along the lines as we see on a car, for on a hub for that matter. On the ECA piece, this is, again, all 3D print. It has some pretty substantial thickness to it, so it's nice and robust. And on the inside over here, we have this interesting feature where I have these fastener locations, and you can see these hex sections integrally printed on. This is so that when you mount on the fastener, it just locks into place over here, and it makes for a nice low profile section. And when you're tightening the bolts, it gives you a little bit of extra strength, and it makes it easier to tighten the units. The other thing I want to mention is the long stem that we have here. This is going to interact with the ECA final drive, and we'll see what that looks like as the piece gets assembled. But that's not all, because in order to have even more strength, the unit is hollow, and I have a 1/4 inch steel shaft that's going to be mounted in this section over here. The shaft is held in place with a drop of glue, but in addition to that, we have two little pilot holes here, and this is so that you can actually drill through the material and into the steel and have two lock pins inserted in place. Once they are snipped away, these things are not going anywhere, and the piece is going to be mounted on permanently. With that design, you can then slide this thing into place, and it'll be held securely into the final drive and into the transmission cover, but it won't be a weak mount, and the thing will be nice and sturdy. Again, we'll see what that looks like in a moment. As I mentioned before, here we have some metal fasteners. These are going to be used to secure the sprocket drum to the hub itself, and from there takes us to some fasteners that are not made out of metal. We have here a sprue containing several smaller hex bolts, and these are faux hex bolts, and these are going to be used to help secure the sprocket rings to the drum itself. Like I mentioned before, these units are designed for static use, so for static display, this type of design here is more than adequate. If you want to replace these, by the way, with metal fasteners, you can do so if you wish. But again, for the purposes of this build and the way I designed it, these ones here are going to be more than suffice. If you're asking, well, John, why would you just go ahead and print these? Wouldn't it just be better to use metal fasteners again? Well, again, there's something that's found on these units here that are just not found on real metal fasteners. And that is in the center here, if we could get the runner to get zoomed in. So once it's all focused out, you can see that the center portion of every one of these hex bolts have a round dimple in them. This is again true to form to the real unit. Every single Sherman sprocket that I've seen in person have these pattern of fasteners for the sprocket ring. The set contains more than enough to assemble two of these sprockets, so there is a oopsie insurance policy built into it. The other thing I also want to mention is that if you look here on the reverse side of the drum, there are no hex nuts found on the inner portion. Again, this is true to form to the real one. On the real unit, these end sections here are threaded, so the need for hex nuts on the inside here is not necessary, or is found on the real units. However, if you are looking to replace these ones with metal fasteners, perhaps then you may want to add a metal nut on the inside to scale, again, just for some added strength if that's something that you deem fit, but again, that's not required for the assembly of the piece. The next thing I want to mention are these faux fasteners here. These faux fasteners are the outward details for the fasteners found on the hub. And if you're confused by that because it seems a bit redundant, well, that's done on purpose. On the piece itself, again, we're going to have these fasteners emerging, and then we could secure the sprocket in place like the real one. Well, if we have the real fasteners exposed, why do we need to have this extra set here? Well, the answer is quite, again, simple. On the Sherman tank, the lug nuts that are used to secure the sprockets to the hub are a certain design and pattern, and they look very different compared to just standard off-the-shelf fasteners that we have here. So what I went ahead and did was I developed these units here, and these are a detail shoe that slips over the metal fastener. This way, you're getting your cake and eating it too. You have the strength of the metal fastener, but with the outward detail appearance that is correct to the real one. If I go ahead and grab one of these sections over here, you get to see the detailing in better focus. So note the nut itself is much longer compared to a standard M3 hex nut. And it has this portion here where it goes in and is rounded on the edge. On the bottom, there's a washer that's integrally printed onto this unit over here. And then on the outward appearance, we have what would be on the real one, the threaded section that the unit is actually bolted to. And on this, there are two options. We have this unit over here with the dimple in the center. And then there's this unit over here that is dimpleless. And yes, these things are like this on the real unit. And there's no real set pattern. I've seen them all, I've seen none, and I've seen them intermix. So you have both found on the ECA sets. In addition, and of course, and then we have here on the inner portion, it's integrally printed that has the clearance here to fit an M3 hex nut, as well as also some fastener that emerges from the stem itself. In addition to this set here being offered on the ECA VVSS sprockets, I'm also offering these as a standalone set in case anyone has an Armortech Sherman or M3 Lee. Well, on those units, it's assembled in the same way where we have just big fasteners like this emerging from the hub. But again, if you want to go ahead and have that accurate look, with this set here, it just drops in on top of those, and you'll again have the appropriate detailing for that pattern of vehicle. Moving on from the sprockets takes us to another component that is one that honestly I have been wanting to retire and replace with a 3D printed component now for many, many years. In fact, the very first original item that this piece is evolved from was one that I posted on the ECA catalog when I literally first started the ECA catalog all the way in the way back in 2003. So fast forward to 2025, here we have the latest incarnation, which is the new M4A3 rear deflector grill set. The set here retires another component that's been on the catalog now since about 2008 or so, and that one and also the original one that came before that were made out of metal. This one here is 3D print, and just like with many of the other items that have come along the path in the last few years, it phases out and retires another handmade metal item that again has been on the catalog for quite some time. And whenever I retire an old metal part, there's always one person out there that feels a little sad because they like the metal, specifically the handmade metal tin work stuff. And although I feel their pain, this is done for good reason. First, the 3D printed one here is far better compared to the metal one can ever be. Just throwing that out there on the table. Trying to fabricate this component here out of sheet metal was always a daunting task. This is one I always have to clear my schedule for whenever I'd have to undertake fabricating one of these components. So with the time saved on that, that is one aspect that's already a plus. But the second one is this thing, again, is far better than any type of hand metal that I could personally make. And I'm pretty decent with hand metal stuff. I'm pretty good at bending metal and all that and soldering it. But even though there are some limitations, and this one here just excels and picks up where the other ones left off. The other thing is that this one here is superior to the old generation metal one because this one here is utilizing the features that I personally was able to study off of the real examples that I had the opportunity to witness and do some photographic walkarounds on. And all of those details were brought into this one over here. So without further ado, again, there's a reason why I've been wanting to produce this for a long time, and here it is on the table in the flesh, and it feels really great. The one last thing I want to mention about this new set is that if you are a fan of the old school metal one, you should have some solace knowing that that has evolved into this one over here because the original templates that I used to produce the old metal ones, well, those were the basis on the ones that we have here. I literally took the old templates, scanned them, and worked with them in the computer program to give you the CAD example. So this one does have its lineage connecting back to the metal one that came before, and then of course all the way to the original metal one that I released all those years ago. So let's go ahead and start with the component itself. So the unit is a single 3D print. All the important aspects on the grill are all there, and no assemblies are required in that regard. So the unit has the appropriate geometry. Note all of the fin sections are curved. And again, this is as per the design. The unit does have the correct geometry, where if we look at the middle section over here, it is indented. And yes, this is not a symmetrical indent, and there is a reason for that. On this portion over here, we have a little hinge mechanism built in, as well as a retention clip, and that has to do with this component that we have here, that I will be going over momentarily. There is this tube that would be welded on the real unit, and that's found right here. The tube is printed hollow, as you can see, and there is also a corresponding hole right here on the top. On the corner sections, you get to see these little rigidity braces, and these are used also to mount the unit to the tank. And again, we'll see what that looks like as the video continues, but you can see the weld beads right over here, integrally printed on. Note the piece is hollow right there. It's just a bent steel bracket that would be just welded in place. The other thing to mention is the rear portion. You can see the cutouts here for the exhaust manifolds, and this is something that is basically missed on just about every other flip grill that's out there on the market in various different scales. But rest assured, the ECA one has you covered. The other thing to mention is with the bulkhead details that we have here. So on the real one, this of course is all stamped sheet metal, and on the 3D printed one, I'm able to get those type of features in place. So you could see where the piece would be stamped on the real unit, and then you could see where it would be spot welded to the plates in question. We also have on the bottom portions here actual welds. These are welded on the real example, so I went ahead and meticulously sculpted each and every one of those little weld beads, and that was actually more time consuming than I really want to have to reimagine. But again, totally worth it in the end. It'll look great once it's painted. And that's really all there is to the grill itself, and this takes us to the other bits of equipment. So the first thing we have here is another 3D printed component, and that's this little thin little rod. The piece has a little hinge built in, and if anyone's wondering what this is, well, this here is how you actually actuate this thing. You'll see how this thing works once it's fitted in place, but the grill itself is actually designed to flip up and lock in the upright position. This is why we actually have this cutout in this section over here, so that the crew member can clear the engine hatch that's located in the back of the M4A3. It could swing out of the way and not make contact with the grill. In order, again, to manipulate this thing, it has this nice little convenient lever that's built into this section over here, and it hinges out when it comes time for to retract and to actuate. One thing that I personally remember vividly from the real example is this little spring clip right over there. And on the real tank, I actually played with this thing. I was able to pop it open and swing it out, and it's the first time that tank has been touched in a very long time in that way. Either way, the clip here is integrally printed on, and it is the correct geometry. The piece is made to be functional, where it can actually pivot open and closed, and to do that, it's facilitated with this little sewing needle over here, or sewing pin here. I keep getting those two confused. It's a sewing pin, and that's going to be used to actually act as the hinge pin to lock it in place. The unit, it's actually pretty robust too. The unit is fully drilled out, or I should say is printed hollow with the hole right over there, so no drilling needs to be done by the builder or lining up needs to be done. It's right there, ready to go, ready for the installation of the pin from the get-go. The other thing is this tube that we have here, and the reason why there's this tube here is that there is a lock lever that needs to be bent to shape, which is done with this aluminum rod over here, where you just bend it to shape, and this actually is what's used to lock this thing in the upright position when you need to get access to the engine. I was thinking on actually integrally printing it in, but in a way where it's kind of encapsulated in here, so it still functions. Something that's really cool. I see a lot of people do that with 3D prints. However, for this one, I just erred on the side of caution, and I just made it where it's just a metal piece that you bend to shape and install it in that location. It just gives it for some extra strength. The other thing that's included are a set of fasteners. So we have two brass fasteners that are bolts, and other two that are nuts. Obviously, these are going to be used to hinge this thing in place so that it can be mounted to the tank and then potentially hinge upward like this when you want to display it in that manner. The holes, though, admittedly are a little bit smaller compared to the fasteners, and this is something that may be subject to change, or I just might leave it tight like that, so you just have to go in here with a pin vise to open up the tolerances, which is something that's probably a good idea in case you want the piece to hinge and you don't want it to flop around very loose. But nothing much needs to be said over here. It's time to get this thing assembled. Moving on to the next and last new bit of equipment that has been added to the ECA catalog, and is one that is definitely going to be used on this build over here, is the new ECA 1/6 scale 3D printed M4 Sherman family front blower cover set. This component over here is another component that retires an older cast resin piece that was on the catalog now for many years. The original component was cast resin, and was very similar to this one here, but this one here retires that older unit. The molds were getting kind of long in the tooth, and plus, there were always certain things I want to incorporate in this component that now I have the ability to with the new 3D printed technology. So the old one is officially put out to pasture and is officially retired. This component here comprises of three pieces. We have the majority of the guard itself, we have the guard mounting base, and we have a section here of varmint mesh. In contrast with the old school one just effectively gave you this component over here, and this here was divided into three parts. We had the top cover plate, we had the mounting base, and we had a metal bracket here that needs to have been bent by the builder, not to mention two little faux fasteners that would be added in place. This set here definitely streamlines that quite a bit, and no assembly is required in that regard. So the piece itself is still a multi-piece assembly, but this was done on purpose. Starting with the hull mounting bracket, this component over here would be found on the real vehicle, where on the front section between the bow hatches where the blower is found, this unit would be welded to the area, and this would allow the mounting portion so that the top portion of the mount itself can be fitted in place. The bracket is to scale, And you can see it has the weld beads integrally printed on. No sculpting needs to be done by the builder at all. It's all ready to go from the get-go. The weld beads are to scale, and they are in the exact same locations as the reference vehicle that I was studying in person. And that's all there is to really mention about the bracket, and this takes us to the main portion of the set, which is the cover itself. So like I stated before, the cover in the past had to have been a multi-piece assembly, but not in 3D print. So this is a single 3D print. And it has everything. It has the top mounting bracket. It has the fasteners integrally printed on. There's stems, which is going to be important. I'm going to mention that in a moment. We have the top cover section. We have the front guard area. And most importantly, we have the reinforcement bracket. The bracket itself, again, everything is to scale, and the piece has its interior detailing present as well. So there are some stitch welds in this area over here. And just like on the real one, where it's just some bent piece of stripped steel, these bends and geometry sections are built into the ECAP. So it's not just a 90-degree bend, but you do have the appropriate curve section on the top and bottom, again, to simulate the piece as if it was bent and formed to shape. On the top portion here, this is also something that's misleading. It looks pretty simple, but it's actually got some stuff going on here. It has the little bend in the appropriate location. It also has the appropriate geometry. Note the corners here are curved, just like the real one. The bottom portion is actually all stamped. And again, I have to carefully go ahead and map everything out accordingly in order to get the appropriate appearance. This piece is another bracket that stands above the top bracket, so we have a 3-piece thickness going on over here. And again, this is true to form to the real one. If I temporarily stick these together, you'll see what I mean. Note the piece does overhang slightly from the bottom bracket, again, as per the real unit. The last thing to mention is with the inner recess that we have right here. This was, again, done on purpose so that you have a location and an area to fit the mesh. The mesh needs to be cut to shape, and once that's done, you just drop it into this area over here, add a few drops of glue, and once those glues set, you can then sandwich it together with the bottom bracket, and now that piece isn't going anywhere, and it's held in place just like it is on the real example. As for what type of version the Sherman would get this bit of equipment, this would be primarily found on Shermans with the large bow hatches. So vehicles like, of course, the late or mid-production version of the M4A3, the later versions of the M4A2, and also the later variants of the M4A1. The early versions of the Sherman, like the M4A4 or the original M4, would not get this bit of equipment. Another vehicle that would get this bit of equipment that's in the M4 family would of course be the M4 105 and subsequently following the M4A3 105. So essentially, if it has the large bow hatches, it gets this fella here mounted in between. Skipping ahead a little bit takes us to the point that we have here where the blower has been assembled, and at this point here it's ready for painting and mounting to the model. The fitting goes together very, very quickly. Really, the only work that needs to be done by the builder is just to carefully snip the meshwork to fit in that little recess that I showed before. This is easily done with just a Sharpie. You just put the mesh onto the location, just mark the locations, and snip away with a pair of snips. Once the piece is cut to shape, it drops right in, and then you just simply glue it together, and everything just plugs together as it should. When you're done, this here is the final end result. To assist, I did have some spring clamps on hand that I clipped into these locations here in order to make sure that the glue's set and set firmly and that the mesh doesn't push up on the piece, causing any sort of issues. But with the piece fully assembled, you again get to appreciate the detailing that we have here, both inside and out. And this is definitely a worthy successor to the original one that again has been now retired, with this one here entering into production. Picking up where we last left off, in the previous video I mentioned that the lower hull was essentially wrapped with the exception of the diffuser grill and the sprockets. Well, I forgot that I actually needed a little bit more welds. So you can see that I added the welds on this portion over here. This weld and the real one would connect the mounting plate for the tin work to the sponson. So obviously there would be a weld over there. But the other thing that I negated to add was the secondary weld. Just like I mentioned in the other video, is that the Jumbo has 2 rows of welds due to the extra armor that we have mounted on top of a standard Fisher-built M4A3 hull. So what I did was I added a second row of welds, sculpted with the epoxy, like I mentioned in the previous video. With this added, this now definitely completes the look to something that is a bit more appropriate, specifically for a Jumbo. Also, one other detail that I forgot to add in the previous videos were the row of fasteners. On the rear portion of the M4A3, and this is also true for the other versions of the Sherman as well, there are a row of fasteners found in this area over here, and if I'm not mistaken, I believe that this is for securing on the inner rear fuel tanks, which would be located on this portion here of the vehicle. With the way they are fastened in place, you will have some fasteners protruding from the side portion of the hull. However, the fasteners are in a certain format, and this is something I will be circling back to in a moment. The fasteners are generally something that everyone tends to overlook, and I was even checking some of the modern super kits like from Ryfield and Mank, and I don't believe they have these either, or at least not from the pictures I was able to find online. Either way, the Sherman should have a row of fasteners located in this section over here. For my number and location, I got this again from the walk-around of a real M4A3 Sherman that I was able to do a walk-around on, and the example I had clearly had holes found in these sections over here. The reason why there are holes on that example and not fasteners is because that one, the inside is just gutted out, just an empty shell. So because of that, the fasteners are absent and they're just holes. But there should be fasteners in these areas. As for the fasteners themselves, I have these ones over here, and they have been pre-prepped and are ready for installation. So, like I mentioned before, the fasteners are mounted on in a certain configuration. And you can easily just do it the quick and easy way, which is to just drill a hole into the side portion here of the armor plate, and you can just stick a hex 2x56 fastener in this area over here and call it a day. And for the most part, that'll get you essentially where you need to go. However, I'm going a little bit past that point with the method that I have here, because you see on the fasteners found on the real vehicles, you do not have the head of the bolt on the outside. That's actually on the inner portion of the vehicle, and what's on the outside is the nut with a little bit of the threaded rod protruding outward. So in order to achieve this detailing, I went ahead and fabricated these up over here. Essentially what I did was I just took some 2x56 brass nuts, threaded them onto this dome-headed slot screw to a certain point, and I glued the nut in place with some super glue. Once the glue set, I'm going to snip off the dome head section of the bolt as that's not needed, and then I'll be able to just insert them into the appropriate locations with just a little drop of glue. The reason why I'm going with this approach as opposed to just taking the 2x56 bolt and gluing it just with threads out is that this is much stronger compared to that outcome. That outcome will visually give you the same exact look, and if you're in a pinch, it's a smart way to go, but it is very, very frail that way, and if anything hits it, like the tractor in construction or anything along those lines, has a bad habit or a chance of it getting knocked off. That's not something that's beneficial. This way, you have the added strength of the threaded rod going into the model, so the chances of them popping off are definitely heavily reduced. And here you can see what the hull looks like with the fasteners added in place. Obviously, this gives a tremendous amount of detail to the rear section over here, and it's going to look even better after it's painted and weathered with the panel line accent going in there. It's really going to make things pop quite nicely. One other thing I want to mention is that there is another fastener, and it's slightly concealed by the idler guard right over there. In order to install that one, I actually did it with the cut bolt way. Like I mentioned before, you can take one of these fasteners here, cut off the unneeded threads, sand down the burr area, and then you could just glue the fastener face onto the piece, and that'll give you essentially the exact same look as we have here. But unlike these ones here, which are in a more snag-prone location, there's nothing that's going to be able to snag that because it's literally concealed under the guard. So for that application, it's quite perfect with this type of method. Moving forward brings us to the sprockets here going through their course of construction. This sprocket here is already assembled where we have the two tooth rings mounted onto the center spine, or drum I should say. And the thing's actually pretty rock solid. In order to keep everything in place, just some drops of super glue are used to secure the rings to the hub itself, and also the fasteners in it have a little drop of glue assisting them as well. With the tolerances that the fasteners are, they actually hold the piece in quite nicely. If I get the camera in focus, you get to see what the dimple fasteners look like on the sprocket itself. And again, at least for a very realistic appearance. On the inner portion over here, you get to see the reverse portion of the fasteners. And again, it yields for some very realistic looking results. One other thing to mention is that at this time, this is what a Sherman sprocket will look like when not fitted to the vehicle. A lot of people out there who do modeling dioramas, they have the Sherman with the sprocket removed off the vehicle, and they just leave the center hub section integrally built into, well, if it's a smaller scale build, and also with the fasteners on the outside. However, a real Sherman tank, this is what the sprocket looks like when not fitted to the vehicle. And this brings us now to the other one. So you'll see what it looks like at this time. The one ring has been fitted in place, but the other one has not, or at least not just yet. And at this time, you get to see that I had to make a slight alteration to the piece, and this was done to both of them. And with research and development being what it is, when it came time to assemble the sprocket, I test the track around this section here, which I'll go over in a second. And as it turned out, I had an oopsie where the unit wasn't fitting on the track because it was about a millimeter or two too snug. So, to quote Maxwell Smart,
missed it by that much.
And fortunately, to resolve it was pretty easily done. What I had to do is I just had to create two little spacers here out of some sheet styrene. I glued them to the drum, did the bodywork, drilled out the holes, and now this unit is ready to continue from this point. If you're watching this, fear not, because the production units are going to have these adjustments made. In fact, by the time this video drops, those adjustments have already been made to the production unit. So when you order these sections, or if you order these units, I would recommend if you do, but if you do, the dimensions are going to be appropriate to fit onto the Dragon track without any sort of extra tinkering or other modifications. For the installation, like I said before, it's really all just done with glue, so just a little drop of glue in between the areas here for the fasteners, and I can then drop this thing in place. I do have a single bolt here to act as an alignment jig, so I could go ahead and press the unit in place. And there we have it. The unit is now fitted to the drum, and I'm ready to do the remainder of the fasteners. To check, I assembled a length here of the Dragon track. This is the track I am going to be using on this model. This track here is currently stock with little snaps. I'm going to be going over that as the video, or as the series continues. Stay tuned for that. But for now, just for testing, it's more than suffice. At this point here, just like I do on the Armortech builds, to make sure that the timing is correct, I just go ahead and I wrap the track around the sprocket over here, creating a closed loop, and here you get to see and verify that the teeth are all lined up appropriately and that there is no mishap or mismatching with the timing. Timing on sprockets on all tanks is absolutely crucial. If the timing is off, the sprocket and the track are not going to mesh properly, and it's just going to be a complete disaster. At this point here, I can start pinning the remainder of the fasteners in place. This one here was removed off of the sprue. Cleanup is very, very minute. Just a little bridge to snip away. Short work done with the clean snips. At this point, I'm going to take a X-Acto, and I'm just going to go up and down the surfaces here on the bolt itself. With the tolerances being what they are with this printed material, they tend to be a bit snug, which is actually what you want. But if it's too snug, it's not really going to go in that easy. So just a couple swipes like you saw I just did there with the X-Acto will really be all that you need. At this point here, a little drop of glue. I can just line it up here on one of these holes and just slide the unit in place. After a little swipe or two on the X-Acto, the unit just slides right in where it needs to go. And that's all there is to it. At that point there, now that I have 2 points of contact, but you know what, I'll go ahead and be even more cautious and have 3 points of contact, we can then remove the track. Just like so. Press this guy in. And And once he's pressed in, this thing is now held in place with 3 units, so alignment's no longer going to be an issue. At that point there, I can peel off the track and just continue with the remainder of the fastener assembly. No point getting on camera. Let's skip ahead to the next point. The next step from the sprocket assembly is to get the hub assembled. Here you can see one of the hubs fully assembled at this point. At this point here, it's actually ready for mounting onto the sprocket. In order to... a little loose over there. Okay, so in order to get the piece assembled, the steel shaft gets inserted into the hub housing over here. This was done with the use of just a rubber mallet. I also used my arbor press to make sure the piece was seated fully. Bit of a risky procedure because you could accidentally break if you had too much pressure, but I was able to get through without any problems. Now, with the way the piece is designed, you have these 2 holes over here, and the original intention is that you could drill these out and put a steel pin through in order to secure the rod in place. However, with the tolerances of everything, it's so tight that drop of glue is really all that was needed, and the piece was able to be inserted just fine. Obviously, the feature is still there. I'm not going to get rid of it, so in case anyone wants to make the piece even stiffer with the pins, you're definitely free to do so. Back to the face over here, you get to see what it looks like with the thread section protruding from the hub, and this is again true to form to the real one, albeit on the real one, the fasteners are again a bit larger compared to the M3 fasteners that are used on this model. But either way, the point still stands. You still get some pretty cool looking accuracy out of the piece, even in this configuration. And after a few moments of tightening down the fasteners, here you get to see one of the sprockets with the inner hub now secured to the sprocket itself. This is not the same one from the previous scene, that's this one over here. This one here has a mixed bag of lengths of fasteners. Normally the set's going to have M3 by 12 millimeter hex heads. Unfortunately I don't have, or I ran out of the by 12, so I just used whatever was in my bin to flesh out the rest. Either way, normally this would be a bit of a problem. However, that's not going to be a problem here because, again, we have the shoes here that go in place and are going to make everything more appropriate. So at this point, you get to see what it looks like with the standard M3 fastener in place. And when I drop the detail shoe on, you really get to see just how much different it looks in comparison to the standard off-the-shelf fasteners. To install these in place, this is just going to be done, again, with a little drop of super glue. And then you just drop them into the appropriate location that they need to go. Once the unit is all set, it'll look something like this. And presto, the conversion is complete. As you can see, it really changes the look of the sprocket and it gives it that more realistic look compared to just having these standard fasteners emerging from the stem. At this point here, this sprocket is ready to head off into primer, paint, and then I can mount it onto the final drive onto the tank itself. We'll see what that looks like as the video goes on. However, before I go ahead and assemble the final sprocket, I might as well show what the hub looks like when fitted to the final drive. As again, this is what the unit would look like on the real Sherman tank without the sprocket fitted in place. As for how the unit goes in, it just slips into place just like so. And with the camera off the tripod, you get a better view of everything in better light. It's a very interesting feature that the Sherman tank family does have, and it's a unique one that you don't always get a chance to see, specifically when you're building models. Almost always, this detailing here is integrally molded onto the sprocket, so having the unit in the setup over here, it's a very interesting and unique way to go ahead and render the build. However, nothing much more needs to be said about that. I'm going to go ahead, pluck them off, and do the final assembly. And with the final sprocket assembled, I can now go ahead and get this thing primed, painted, and slipped into place onto the model. Also, at this time, we could go ahead and compare and contrast it with a Dragon 1/6 scale Sherman sprocket. Again, this sprocket here is designed to be in spec with this one so that it can use the exact same tracks as I mentioned before. But here you can quickly compare and contrast the sprocket found on the stock Dragon model with the ECA counterpart. First thing I want to point out, the Dragon one is absent that little divot that is iconic on the Sherman sprockets. It's right over there. The next thing to point out is with the size of the mounting fasteners. Here we can see the fasteners that secure the sprocket to the hub, and you can see what they look like on the ECA counterpart. Again, much more dimensional and more in tune to the real vehicle. The other thing we can look at this time are the fasteners that would mount the ring to the rim itself. And here you can see it right here. Note it has those little divots found on those fasteners that I mentioned before. The other thing to mention is with the inner portion, you can see that the Dragon sprocket, one of the weaker aspects of it is that it is hollow on this portion over here. It just really just kills the look of the unit, while on the ECA counterpart, it's through and through. The only place where it was cut out was where it is on the real one, whereas that scallop section found on the inner portion so it could lock onto the hub. Or the rim. The drum, whatever you want to call it. The only difference that the Dragon sprocket has over the ECA one is also with the pattern. This here is an early pattern of Sherman sprocket. What identifies this are these spokes that we have over here. This is something that's indicative on earlier versions of the Sherman. As production continued, they realized, well, we don't really need to add those little cutouts, so it'll just save some time to just have the thing as one solid piece, and that's the pattern that we have here. Again, this is more indicative of mid to later production units. It's also, as of note, the exact same sprocket tooth rings, actually both are, that are used on the HVSS Sherman tank, and that also carried over into the M26 and M46 pattern of vehicles. The other thing to mention is with the center portion itself. On the Dragon one here, pretty simple, straightforward. While on the ECA one, we have the flange sections, as well as this one here is the version with the rigidity angles that I referenced before. The other thing to mention about the ECA piece is that you'll notice on the stem over here there's this little inlet. This inlet is done by design, and this is so that you could slide on washers like this here. And I always, on my static builds, have washers that separate the sprockets or even the rear idlers from the mounts themselves. This is done, as I discovered this many moons ago. It adds a little bit of a space between the sprocket or the wheel and the housing of one sort or another, and on top of that, it just makes the piece just glide and rotate a bit easier, which is something that will also be beneficial when the model is finished. For this one here, from experimenting with the other unit that was put onto the model, 3 washers here are what's used to get the spacing just right, and also once it's fitted in place, it tends to hold it on in a better depth. Moment of truth, time to slide this guy in place. Obviously, we already saw what it looked like with the center piece before, but now with this guy completed, slides on, and presto, it's where it needs to be. With the camera off the tripod, you get to see the spacing that the sprocket has with the final drive. This is the correct spacing that is required, where we have just enough clearance for the fasteners to clear the final drive itself. Because of those washers on the inside, this is the most it could be inserted, so you're not going to have to worry about this thing hugging or scraping on the inner portion here of the final drive. Definitely has the appropriate look required for a Sherman tank. Obviously, the sprocket was also added to the opposite side as well. At this time, the sprockets are indeed ready for primer and paint, and then afterwards they could get their weathering. Now, the sprockets are not going to be fitted permanently to the model at this time. On older builds, I didn't mount them permanently at all. With how long that steel shaft was, once it's fitted in place, kind of just stays there, and there was never really a need to anchor it in place. However, for this one here, I may go ahead and add a anchor system, and well, let me go ahead and adjust the camera so you get to see what I'm talking about. With the camera placed on the inside of the model, and hopefully it is not a real bad echo, you can see the front portion here of what is on the outside, the front transmission cover. If I stick my hand through the hatch over here, you get to see the steel rods right here, and these are the sprockets that obviously I slipped on before. So in order to mount the sprockets on permanently, but still have the ability to spin, one way to do so is with a washer right over here. And then, now that there's a washer placed on the unit, I could go ahead and get a 1/4-inch collar and slip it on, tighten the fastener, and then this guy here is never going to be able to come off. This is something that I'm more likely going to do as the build progresses towards the end, specifically when it comes time for installing the track, as just like on the smaller ones, it's a bit easier to do sometimes when the sprocket is not yet permanently attached. Also, the sprocket needs to be thoroughly primed and painted along with the remainder of the lower hull portions before I can go ahead and get these things fitted in place, because obviously you're not going to be able to get to those rear detail sections or the hull sections with the sprockets fitted permanently at this time. But that's something that, again, more than likely is going to happen as the build progresses. And after not a whole lot of time later, here you can see the unit fitted in place. The unit is fastened to the ECA extenders that I referenced in several videos ago, but this is how the flip grill would be attached to the Sherman. If I readjust the camera to the side, you'll get a better idea on how the thing actually fits in place. And with this camera angle here, it should give you a good idea on what I'm trying to convey. So here you see the hull extender right here. This here is the rear plate. The rear plate is where all the fittings like the exhaust manifolds, the rear engine hatch, and the other doodads are attached in place. Here we have the rear armor plate right here, and you notice the extender literally just continues from this portion of the hull to the end. And this is important to note because on many smaller scale examples of the M4A3, and not just smaller scale, even the larger scale ones like in 135, 116, and yes, even the Dragon 1/6 scale counterpart screw this up. For some reason, they think that the hull seems to end right here with the firewall. That's not the case. The hull does extend all the way out to this portion over here, and it's closed in on the top portion that you'll see again when I shift over the camera. Well, the reason why they do this is because on the real tank, the inner portion over here is where the radiators are housed. And on the back of the radiators, there are these two very large fans. Why this is relevant is because that is why the rear portion of the M4A3 has this shape. The entire rear portion is one giant large cooling duct. The cool air gets sucked in from the outside via the rear engine grills, and then that passes through the radiators, and then it emerges from the underside here of the vehicle. Because of this design, you have a ton of air getting blown downward into this direction, and this has the effect of blowing up dust from the floor, which would give the tank a rooster tail, and it could potentially give away its position, or at least make it much more noticeable in a anti-gun sight or something along those lines. So what was designed was the flip grill. The grill here is intended to divert a portion or a large portion of that downward air and redirect it 90 degrees outward this way, which does cut down on the rooster tail effect. In addition, of course, to the rooster tail effect, it also helps redirect and diffuse the exhaust manifold smoke that are emitted from the exhaust manifolds here and here, which is why we have those two giant large cutouts found on the rear portion of the grill work. With the camera readjusted again from the bottom view, you get a better idea of what I was referring to. This is that shelf that I was referencing before that's connected to the hull extender. And on the real unit, these three fasteners here are used to secure the radiators in place. You can see again how this entire open area here just becomes a giant air duct for the air to flow out. And you can see why the design of the grill here is in the perfect location to redirect that exhaust air or the cooling fan air and redirect it outward as opposed to blowing it straight down. It's also because of this grill why the M4A3 specifically has these two protective wings that descend from this area, and these are solely intended for use to protect the grill here from any sort of particulate that gets kicked up and dragged up by the rear idler wheels. The grill itself is not exactly made out of heavy-duty gauge steel, so the guards over here are intended for this purpose. However, the grill being installed is one thing, but it is also fully functional in a multitude of ways. One, if this thing did actually have radiator grills in the section over here, this would actually help divert the air going 90 degrees. But in addition to that, the retractability function is built into this model. So I'm just going to go ahead and snap this little guy out over here. As you can see, and this is what you need on the real one, because obviously getting access to this engine hatch over here is a bit troublesome with the grill in the way. So this guy here would pivot out. Now this is pretty thin, so I'm not exactly going to be able to have the leverage to pivot this thing in place. But on the real one, that's what it would be used for. Some guy would hold it here and here and pivot upward, and the piece would just hinge out of the way. But as you can see, the ECA one is still fully functional in that regard, and it will actually snap into place just like so. But it's not just that little lever that's fully functional, because the entire grill is functional in that it can pivot out of the way. That's facilitated with these two fasteners that we have here and here that I mentioned before. And when the pieces are all properly aligned, I just pivot this guy up. You have this little latch over here, this pulls in, and then it clears this little angle strip that we have right here on the bottom as a leading edge. And that angle strip is used to lock this guy in place like so. At this point here, the grill is locked in the upright position, and now the guy who's working on this thing can get access to all of the equipment back here, being from the rear engine hatch, exhaust manifold. You can even tighten up the idlers if need be, get access to the tow points, and even the tow hitch when it's installed. To deploy the grill, well, you just hit this little latch right there, and then from there this piece just hinges down 90 degrees till it reaches its home position. Part of the reason why I showed this system is, one, it's a cool feature to have built into the model, but the second thing is that on just about every single 1/35th scale and larger kit on the market, this piece is just depicted in the deployed state that we have here and is non-functional. So it's a very interesting feature to build into the model for several reasons. One, it's more true to form to the real one. Two, it could be used to assist a diorama setting if I have some crew members back here working on the tank. And three, it's again, just a why not bit of detailing, and it just makes for a better build overall. Also, it doesn't take any extra work to get the thing to function as opposed to having it static. The piece is just held in place with these two fasteners over here, and that's it. If the holes are properly lined up, the hinging will actually happen naturally. One other thing I want to mention is that this grill here is the type of grill that we've seen throughout the majority of the World War II time frame. At the very tail end of World War II and into the post-war era, this grill here was revised with two larger grills that descended into these two sections here, and those had a much larger grill face to them, but still were able to hinge out of the way. However, unlike the World War II one, which is designed to hinge upward into the cubby over here, the post-World War II ones are designed to hinge outward and lock into two receptacles that are built into the rear portion of the vehicle. We tend to see these type of features on very late M4A3s, but more likely, or I should say more commonly seen, are on M4A3E8s. Having said that, I wouldn't be surprised if there is a World War II Sherman that, or a World War II M4A375 like this one over here, that had the flip grills in that type of manner, if not just built from the factory like that, or possibly as a retrofit, which these vehicles did get quite a number of after the immediate World War II time frame era. Jumping back to the sprockets, you get to see the two units here on the table, and since the previous scene, they've been painted with their primer and their base coat. At this point here, the only thing that's left to be done on them is the weathering, but of course this will be added as the project continues. However, it is at this point here where we get to really appreciate the paintwork and the final outward appearance of the units in this format. As obviously it's easier done once everything is painted, as opposed to when it's left in its el natural material. Since these are basically ready for mounting onto the model this time, let me briefly take off the washers, and now we could really get a good look at the detail quality found on these pieces. In addition to the detail fidelity, again, you could really appreciate the 3D printer that I use for the manufacture. As you can see, the pieces look absolutely flawless. No harsh lines or anything like that that's found on these pieces here, and they basically look like they're made out of injection molded polystyrene, or metal even. One thing's for certain, they don't look like they're done with some garage type 3D printer. If you notice on the inside portion over here, I went ahead and masked it all off. Getting paint into these locations isn't really necessary, nor is it helpful. So I just went ahead and masked this area off with some paper towel, and I went ahead and put some masking tape onto the axle over here just prior to the things going into paint. If we go ahead and take out the other one, you really get to appreciate those ribs on this one over here. And also you get to appreciate those details that I was referencing before, being the domed out mounting fasteners, as well as also the mix of lug nuts, dimple and dimpleless. As for the orientation on the stems themselves, I've seen a grab bag, so you can either have them all one type or the other type or a mix, and there's no set pattern on the location of these sections over here. So it just adds more to the fun of the build if you go ahead and just wing it accordingly. Again, you really get to appreciate that depth here of the lug nuts themselves. It just looks so much better compared to just having just the real fasteners left out and exposed, and using that to pass off for the detailing that would be found on this section here. And just like with the sprockets, the deflector grill was also primed and painted with its base coat as well. And just like with those units, once it's in its final coat, it really does shine, and you really get to see all those subtle nuances that I was referencing before. The only thing that's going to be left on this is to, of course, weather everything. This needs to be done prior to installation because, like I mentioned before, it's really easier to do that at this point as opposed to when it's mounted into the vehicle. All of the little tabs and locks still are fully functional, even with paint on them. Although admittedly, this little lever here is a bit tricky to sometimes deploy, but the little spring clip actually does do its job. And it works extremely well. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, the very last bits of detailing that were preventing me from working upward towards the superstructure have now been completed and are out of the way. At this point here, detailing wise, the lower hull is done. The only thing that remains is for me to assemble the tracks. However, I always do this towards the tail end of the build, so it's not really relevant at this time. Before, though, I can start digging into the superstructure detailing, I do need to do one other procedure, and that is to thoroughly weather the lower portions of the hull. Once the top portion starts getting its detailing, it becomes a bit more frail and fragile, and trying to flip this thing over and painting those areas becomes a bit more problematic at that point. So that's something that's best left done sooner rather than later. However, before I can do that, I do have to make some modifications to the superstructure, cutting some areas out as well as doing some revisions. This needs to be done first because frankly it makes a bit of a mess, and it's best to get that out of the way now prior to getting the lower portions all nicely painted and weathered. So that's going to be really the focus of the next video. Good news is, however, you're not going to have to wait too long for that video to premiere because I have a really good head start on those modifications. In fact, if you're really keen-eyed, you could probably play Where's Waldo on the scene you're watching right now to know exactly what portion of the vehicle I've already worked on at this point. But, again, that's best left up for the next video. And with that, that wraps up this project update video for the 1/6 scale M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being 1/6 scale project update videos like this one over here, or the other smaller scale model showcase videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook, where I have photographs of this particular build that have been posted since the project start, as well as photographs of the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again, and I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Take care.